who has 11 minutes.
Laskin Corla. I welcome the publication of this bill and its wide-ranging provisions that seek to strengthen our laws combating child pornography, the sexual grooming of children, the updating of laws relating to incest and indecent exposure, and amendments which focus on the victims of sexual offences. The provision criminalising the purchase of sex included in Part 4 of this bill is a section that I welcome and being brought forward. According to the Immigrant Council of Ireland statistics, on any given day between 800 and 1,000 women and children in Ireland are advertised online for sex. Of that number, between 87 and 98% of those are migrant women, and many are from impoverished backgrounds. If sex work was a choice, surely this statistic would reflect the makeup of the population of our country, which it definitely does not. Having informed myself of all the views to the introduction of the criminalisation of purchase of sex, I can't help but think that if prostitution was a choice, why are the majority of those in prostitution coming from very vulnerable circumstances and from marginalised and targeted social groups? Isolation, cultural differences, language difficulties, debt bondage and the ease with which they can be controlled all contribute to the vulnerability of victims of sex work trafficking. In 2013, I introduced a bill to this House which also sought to criminalise the purchase of sex. Not surprisingly, at the time it was voted down by the government, and it has taken another 3 years before today's version of the bill is debated in the Dáil. The year that the bill I introduced was voted down, 83 people were trafficked into Ireland for the purposes of sexual exploitation. So we can only imagine how many in total over the past 3 years have experienced the same fate. Yet not one single trafficker or pimp has been convicted under the 2008 Act and since the time the bill was introduced back in 2013. And while the purpose of that bill was an attempt, and I think the so-called Nordic model has been an attempt to actually try and reduce trafficking of women for sex work as well, but the other aspect of that bill, which I had hoped at the time, was to actually effect a cultural change. And it wasn't really even to look at convicting people of purchasing sex, but was to try and feed into a process of change within our society where men don't feel, or men should learn that it's not okay to purchase the body of a woman or a man for sex. And I feel that's something that we should, as a society, aim to achieve, to change that culture, so that men don't feel that is their right to do that. And I think that's partly what legislation should try and achieve, is to try and effect that cultural change. We see the alcohol bill going through the Houses at the moment, which is trying to effect change within the culture of alcohol abuse that we have in our society. And I think it's reasonable to use legislation to try and effect that culture change as well. The only problem I have with the Part 4 of the Act is that with this change actually being included in a very wide-ranging Sexual Offences Act, it actually minimises the potential and the discussion that you can have around that change in the culture and in society that we should be working towards, and I think trying to achieve. You know, one out of 50, I think it's 1 in 15 men in Ireland have purchased sex in the past, so that's about 6% of the male population. I think it's something that we should try to achieve to reduce that actual the demand by using legislation to do that, and I think that's something that is worthwhile. I also welcome the added provisions included in the criminal offence for the prostitution of a person who has been trafficked. Upholding human rights is a central tenet here, ensuring that the rights of those trafficked for the purposes of sexual exploitation are vindicated in legislation. Legislation can effect change, as I said, but not as a standalone act. It must coincide with resources to fund the vital frontline services and organisations which help to protect those in prostitution and also help those who wish to get out of prostitution. Legislation can affect cultural change, but we need to see the other initiatives to also facilitate that change through education and through the responses. And there's no doubt that for a huge amount of women involved in the sex trade, it is outside societal differences that encourage them to enter that, and it's not really, maybe it's not really a choice, but it's a choice of circumstances that they live in that they end up in the sex trade. I would urge the Minister, alongside the implementation of this piece of legislation, to allocate necessary resources and investments for frontline services and organisations supporting exit strategies and the health and well-being of those victims of sex exploitation. Service providers are working with very few resources and limited personnel, and I think the fact that outside of Dublin there are no dedicated services for those engaged in prostitution is simply shocking as well, because the sex trade is not exclusively within the capital, it's not exclusively within our larger cities, it is in all our small towns and villages right across the country. There have been concerns as well in relation to Part 4 of the bill, and while I support the tenet to criminalise the purchase of sex, I do want to see certain aspects strengthened via amendments as the bill goes through its course in the committee of both houses. Firstly, the issue relating to the brothel-keeping provisions in the bill. We know that women that can choose to work together indoors for safety, yet they are liable to be prosecuted for operating a brothel. Just last weekend, as has been mentioned by other members, 4 women were fined €200 each for brothel-keeping in Galway, even though Gardaí suspected they were trafficked into Ireland for the purposes of sexual exploitation. And I know it has been said that the women themselves denied that they were trafficked for sexual exploitation, and that's probably what they would do, is deny it, because if they said that they were trafficked for exploitation, they would be allowed to stay in the state until the perpetrators were prosecuted, and then they would be deported. So what incentive is there for them to actually expose the trafficking that has taken place? And while this aspect of the bill will help to prosecute the criminal gangs, possibly, who operate the vast majority of prostitution in the country, we need to ensure it does not inadvertently affect victims. Concerns have been raised by the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission in relation to Part 4 of the bill, which maintains and increasing the penalty for the existing offence of brothel keeping. I believe this could place persons engaged in prostitution who are working together for safety in greater danger, as they may have no choice but to opt to work alone despite the risks that are involved. Again, the Gardaí must respond appropriately to exploitation in these circumstances, but this requires the adequate resourcing of frontline services, including the Gardaí. Secondly, the decriminalisation aspect of selling sex must be fully realised. I know that currently the act of prostitution is not criminalised, but there are issues around the solicitation offence and profiting from the proceeds of crime element. I understand that the Taoiseach amended this bill in the Seanad to explicitly decriminalise on-street solicitation. However, an amendment was then added under the Public Order Act to criminalise loitering for the purposes of prosecution. So you give with one hand and take away with the other. And I am concerned that this could end up replacing the solicitation offence and focus the Gardaí's attention on that. I would urge the Taoiseach to reconsider this offence and remove it as the bill is scrutinised in the future, so the selling of sex will be fully decriminalised. Organisations who deal with the victims of sexual exploitation are of the understanding that women will not be targeted by the Criminal Assets Bureau under the offence of profiting from the proceeds of crime. We need assurances from the Minister that this will be the case. Now that we are criminalising the purchase of sex, we may need to address this once again, but in a way that does not lead to women being targeted by criminal gangs for further financial exploitation. This may be outside the remit of this bill, but I think it is worth looking at in the context of this legislation. Thirdly, this bill, as in the case in Sweden, must be monitored and reviewed to measure its effectiveness and impact. The Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission has recommended that the proposed reform be kept under periodic review to monitor and evaluate the impacts of the change in the law. The Commission also recommends that the proposed reform is accompanied by ongoing research on best practices, awareness-raising programmes, targeting information campaigns and educational programmes. Legislation in Northern Ireland compels the Department of Justice to review the operation of the reform within 3 years of its coming into operation, including with regard to the number of arrests and convictions, an assessment of the impact on the safety and well-being of persons provided for payment of sexual services, and the Department's assessment of the extent to which the reform has operated to reduce human trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation. This is something we should consider here, and I would argue that it should be reviewed within 2 years of coming into effect, and I think we can learn from the Northern Ireland process. The Human Rights and Equality Commission states that there is a large amount of conclusive evidence that a standalone legislative approach does not have the definitive effect of reducing trafficking in human beings for sexual exploitation. We must recognise that legislation alone cannot protect people in prostitution. Legislation must be enacted alongside research, strategies, monitoring and, most importantly, adequate resourcing for frontline services which reach out to those in prostitution, providing exit strategies and support services in the meantime. Ireland's implementation of the Council of Europe Convention Convention action against trafficking in human beings will be monitored later this year by the Group of Experts on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings, GRETA, which will visit Ireland in December 2016. GRETA has recommended that states which have adopted the Swedish model keep their legislation under review to measure the impact of the provision of protection and assistance to victims of trafficking and the effective prosecution of traffickers. I hope the measures that we've discussed in this bill, and which have been echoed by many in this hall, are taken on board by the Minister and the Government throughout this legislative process.